So to finish round 2, we need to make 5 more increase stitches, 1 in every remaining stitch of round 1, because round 2 is a total of 6 increase stitches. But before we do that, I want to show you how to use the stitch marker. So these stitch markers are used to mark the very first stitch of whatever round you're working on. And that's because you're going to be doing a lot of counting coming up to be able to make sure that you accurately follow the pattern. So the stitch marker is going to help you be able to keep count, and even better, when you inevitably make a mistake, especially because you're just learning how to crochet, you only have to ever undo up until the stitch marker. So you don't have to lose a bunch of the work that you did if you keep using the stitch marker. So what we need to do is find the very first stitch of round 2. And to do that, we're going to take a look at the rim. So first, pull your hook away from the piece so that the loop gets really big. Then put your hook aside. We're doing this because in case you accidentally pull on the yarn connected to the yarn ball, you got a bunch of leeway now so that you won't accidentally undo your stitch. Now rotate your piece so that you're looking at the rim. And at the rim, you should be able to see these horizontal V's. That is what represents a stitch. So we just did the increase stitch, which counts as 2 single crochet stitches put in the same hole. So that is why you can identify what it looks like by looking for this loop, seeing which V the loop comes from. That's the last stitch you just made. And therefore, the very first stitch of the round is actually the one next to it, this one. So this is where we're going to put the stitch marker. So you can either stick your hook in here so you remember where it is, or just keep a close eye on it, or hold on to it with your hand as you undo or take out this stitch marker, which opens like a safety pin, and then put it under that horizontal V over here. So now we know that this is the very first stitch of round 2. So in case we mess up, we can always just undo to this point. And we're also going to use this to help us keep track of how many stitches we've made in round 2. So now let's crochet the rest of round 2. Get into crocheting position. Remember, that's facing your palm, your non-dominant hand palm to you, wrapping the working yarn around your pinky, up over your index finger, and then holding on to the piece with your thumb and middle finger. And now, since we moved the stitch marker, both the stitch marker and the loop are on the same side as your dominant hand. Now the other question becomes, how do you know which way to put your hook in here? So you want to put your hook in the loop so that if you were to pull on the yarn connected to the yarn ball, the piece of the yarn that moves is the one that's closer to you. You don't want to put your hook in this way because you can see even here that the loop is twisted. So put it in this way. Pull on the yarn, connected to the yarn ball, until your hook is next to your piece, but not so tight that your hook can't easily move through the loop. Okay, when you did that, everything probably got loose on your hand, so you can try to pick up the working yarn as close to the piece as possible as you do this wrap around your hand again. Okay, back in crocheting position. So the next question is, how do we know where to put our hook? So there's 2 ways you can tell at this point. One is from counting. We know the stitch marker marks the very first stitch of round 1. Therefore, we know that the stitch next to it is the second stitch, which means that's a complete increase stitch, which means we want to go for the next available V, which is over here, to start the new increase stitch. Another way you could tell, if you can't see that, is what I call the tugging method. It goes like this. You hold on to the stitch that you just made and the piece with the other hand, and then you tug on the stitch you just made to see which hole moves. That's where you had just put your hook. So for us, that means we want to put it in the next hole. So again, we look like we have 3 strands of yarn on our hook. Going to do a yarn over, pull that yarn through just the V, so we've got 2 loops on the hook, And then we're gonna yarn over and pull it through both loops on the hook. And that was one single crochet stitch. And remember to turn this into what we call an increase stitch. We're going to do the same thing in exactly the same spot. So you can do the good old tugging method. And that's going to be where you want to put your hook to complete the increase stitch. So put your hook over here, yarn over, pull that yarn through the stitch so you've got 2 loops on your hook, yarn over again, and pull it through both loops on the hook. So that is your second increase stitch. We can take a moment and pause and make sure that we have done the correct number by counting, starting from the stitch marker, how many horizontal V's there are around the rim. So we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. That sounds good to me. So now you're going to repeat that all the way around. And by the end of it, you should have a total of 12 stitches. You can watch the next video for an explanation for why 6 increase stitches actually equals 12 stitches. But for now, just trust me. So remember, you can do the tugging method to see which hole gets bigger and therefore figure out where you want to put your hook next. And since we're starting a new stitch, we want to put our hook in the next hole. And I'll fast forward and meet you at the end. All right, I've finished round 2, and I know this because 1, I have made my way back to this stitch marker, which marks the very first stitch of every round. So when I'm done with a round, it means I always want to finish at the stitch before it. Another way I know is because I have been counting in my head that I did a total of 12 stitches. But in case you were having trouble keeping count while you were crocheting, which is totally understandable since you're just learning, I would highly recommend counting at the end of every round to make sure that you actually have the right number of stitches. So remember, before you take out your hook, pull it away from your piece so you make the loop really big. And now, this is why we want to use the stitch marker and constantly move it. We want to start counting from the stitch marker. And we know that round 2 has a total of 12 stitches in it. So we need to see a total of 12 horizontal V's. So starting from the one marked by the stitch marker, we see 1 V, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Great. And if you don't have 12 stitches, don't worry about it. Just go to thewoobles.com/oops for some videos that explain how to figure out what might have happened.